Magic has never been about just spells and rituals, it's always been tied to symbols. Whether you're imagining a dusty tome filled with ancient languages or envisioning the arcane symbols scribbled on parchment, these images evoke an undeniable connection between magic and symbols. But symbols in magic aren't just arbitrary designs. They have deep historical roots that go back thousands of years. But where did these symbols come from? How did they evolve? How did simple lines and shapes evolve into powerful tools of transformation, both in the magical and spiritual realms? And why do they continue to have such an impact today, shaping everything from Wicca to astrology? In this video, we explore the origins and evolution of magical symbols, how they developed across civilizations, and why they still resonate in modern-day occult practices. In the earliest recorded instances of magic, Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures provided the foundation for what we now recognize as magical symbolism. However, their approach was vastly different from the way we understand magical symbols today. Instead of focusing on intricate symbols, their magical practices were primarily centered around rituals and spoken words, which were believed to have the power to communicate directly with divine forces. While Egyptians used hieroglyphs that carried both phonetic and symbolic meaning, their use wasn't limited to magic in the way we might think. Take the Earth symbol. It represented the physical world, but it wasn't a magical symbol in the way later traditions would use symbols to summon spirits or transform reality. These hieroglyphs had dual functions, one as part of the written language and another as spiritual markers, but they didn't yet carry the weight of invoking hidden knowledge or power. In ancient Egypt, hieroglyphs were used to encode religious teachings and ritual practices. They were integral to recording sacred texts, prayers, and rituals that connected the priest to the divine. What's important here is that symbols in the Egyptian system were often tied to specific rituals and not seen as independent forces. For instance, the Earth symbol might be used in a spell for protection, but it wouldn't act as a magical force on its own without the spoken words, ritual action, and intention behind it. Hieroglyphs had spiritual significance, but their power was realized only within the context of a ritual, a step in the ongoing process of invoking divine favor or unlocking spiritual insight. Philosophers and priests knew that symbols were an integral part of the divine language, but the magic lay more in the act of speaking and performing rituals rather than in the symbols themselves. In Mesopotamia, the situation was similarly focused on ritual and divine communication. Unlike later magical systems where symbols were perceived as active elements of the spell, Mesopotamian rituals were often recorded on clay tablets or animal livers. The idea of divine communication was central, but the texts themselves did not necessarily emphasize symbolic power in the same way that later systems would. Mesopotamians believed that gods communicated directly with priests, and the written word was the medium through which this divine communication was mediated. Writing on animal livers was seen as sacred, a way to read the divine will. They acted more as a tool for communication than as a medium to channel supernatural forces. These early texts were practical and ritualistic, a means for the magician or priest to gain favor from the gods. But the idea of a symbol carrying inherent mystical power on its own wasn't yet fully realized. The key takeaway here is that while early magical practices were undeniably ritualistic and symbolic, they didn't yet operate in the same way we think of today. The symbols, while used for sacred purposes, didn't yet embody the power or complexity that we associate with magic in later centuries. They were stepping stones, part of a larger evolving system that would eventually give rise to the rich symbolic magical language we see today. Fast forward to the Greco-Egyptian period around the time of the Roman occupation of Egypt. As the Roman Empire expanded, the Roman occupation of Egypt around 30 BCE marked a significant point of contact between two ancient and highly influential cultures, the Greeks and the Egyptians. This era was not simply a time of political dominance, it was a time of deep cultural exchange, syncretism, and the merging of ideas from two ancient civilizations that had already developed sophisticated spiritual and magical practices. When the Greeks and Romans began to rule Egypt, they didn't just impose their own belief systems. They became increasingly fascinated with Egypt's spiritual technologies, its knowledge of the stars, its practices of healing and alchemy, its system of rituals and magical invocations, and its understanding of the divine. The Greeks, with their intellectual curiosity, saw Egypt as a fountain of ancient wisdom, with its sacred texts, cryptic symbols, and esoteric teachings. This led to a syncretistic fusion of Greek and Egyptian beliefs, especially within the magical and philosophical traditions. Greek philosophers such as Plato and Pythagoras were drawn to Egyptian wisdom traditions, especially in areas such as mathematics, astronomy, and metaphysics. Many Greek philosophers travelled to Egypt to study with the priests of Memphis and Thebes, seeking to integrate Egyptian cosmology with their own philosophical systems. In this context, the Greek script began to find its place in Egyptian religious practices. The Greek alphabet was introduced into Egyptian spiritual texts, and the merging of these two writing systems opened the door for the creation of new forms of symbolic expression. Greek philosophical and mystical ideas, such as Platonism and Stoicism, influenced the way Egyptian religious and magical practices were framed. The Ptolemaic period, 305 to 30 BCE, saw Greek-speaking rulers and Egyptian priests exchanging ideas about the nature of the universe, the role of divinity, and the use of sacred symbols. This intellectual environment encouraged the integration of Greek ideas about geometry, mathematics, and divine order with Egyptian religious symbolism, which was already laden with metaphysical and esoteric meanings. The Greeks brought their rational, logical approach to the mystical world, creating a fusion that balanced abstract reasoning with divine revelation. The Greeks valued abstract thought, but they began to integrate Egyptian ideas of ritual, symbolism, and divine communication into their own mystical frameworks. This intellectual exchange created fertile ground for the development of mystical symbols that were no longer just a part of language or ritual. They became a means of connecting directly to the divine. Symbols such as the Ankh or the Eye of Horus, which had once been powerful Egyptian symbols of life and protection, began to evolve with Greek philosophical influence. Greek script and Egyptian hieroglyphs were used in magical rituals that blended Egyptian concepts of spiritual power with Greek views of the soul and divine hierarchy. The fusion of Greek and Egyptian magical practices reached its height during the Hellenistic period and the Roman Empire, when Greco-Egyptian syncretism took form. This fusion led to the development of what we now know as Hermeticism, a spiritual and philosophical system that combined elements of Egyptian religion, Greek philosophy, and Persian influence. The Hermetica, a series of mystical and alchemical texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, are prime examples of this syncretic period. They were written in Greek but deeply influenced by Egyptian thought. These texts emphasize the power of symbols and words to access divine realms and transform the self. The symbolic systems created during this period were used not only in religious practices but in alchemy, astrology, and theurgy, practices that sought to manipulate the elements and interact with divine forces through the use of powerful symbols. The Greek influence on Egyptian magic during this period brought a new structure to the symbolism used in rituals. Greek ideas of geometry, harmony, and balance were applied to the Egyptian symbols, creating a new form of ritual magic that incorporated both philosophical reasoning and symbolic action. As Egyptian hieroglyphics gradually fell into disuse, Neoplatonism, a major philosophical movement, began to shape magical practices. Philosophers started to value mystical symbols that conveyed non-discursive mystical knowledge, instead of focusing on the phonetic meanings of hieroglyphs. Romanticism around Egyptian hieroglyphs also flourished, with many believing that these ancient symbols carried hidden mystical power, even as the understanding of their actual meanings faded away. As the Greek magical papyri began to emerge, non-linguistic symbols that didn't carry a direct meaning through language, started to appear. These were purely symbolic in nature, rather than phonetic, and they quickly became integral to magical rituals. The Ankh symbol. A perfect example is the Ankh, the Egyptian symbol for life. Over time, it evolved from a simple representation of life to a magical tool, enhanced with ringlets at the ends of its crossbars, infusing the symbol with additional magical power. These symbols transformed from being just part of the language to becoming tools of transformation, creating a bridge between the linguistic world and the mystical, unseen world of magic. Neoplatonism, developed by Plotinus in the 3rd century BCE, was a philosophical movement rooted in the teachings of Plato. However, Neoplatonism took a significant departure from traditional philosophy by placing a heavy emphasis on mystical knowledge and the spiritual ascent of the soul. This shift not only influenced Western thought, but also transformed the way symbols were perceived and used, especially in magical and mystical practices. One of Neoplatonism's most influential contributions was its view of symbols. In earlier philosophies, symbols were primarily seen as representations of language, used to convey meaning through spoken or written words. However, Neoplatonism argued that symbols could go beyond the limitations of language. According to Plotinus and other Neoplatonic thinkers, symbols weren't just tools for communication, they were vehicles for deeper mystical understanding. They could carry meanings that couldn't be expressed through regular language, non-discursive meanings that could only be felt, experienced, and directly encountered through mystical experience. Neoplatonism taught that symbols acted as gateways to higher realms of understanding and spiritual knowledge. These symbols were meant to be perceived intuitively rather than rationally. In this sense, they represented a higher, ineffable truth, the divine or transcendental knowledge that could not be fully captured by words alone. Neoplatonists prioritized non-verbal and non-rational forms of knowing, and symbols became the primary tool for accessing this deeper wisdom. These symbols were not to be read or spoken in the traditional sense. Instead, they were to be felt and experienced directly by the practitioner, who would undergo an intuitive understanding of their meaning. For example, geometric shapes, circle-based forms, and abstract signs began to emerge in the magical systems influenced by Neoplatonic thought, particularly in Greco-Egyptian magic. These non-linguistic symbols were thought to be capable of transmitting mystical truths, helping individuals to access higher levels of consciousness and tap into divine wisdom. Neoplatonic philosophers, influenced by the mystical traditions of Pythagoras and Plato, suggested that geometric forms, such as the circle, representing unity, wholeness, and the cosmos, could serve as pathways to the divine. Sacred geometry, with its focus on shapes like triangles and circles, became an essential aspect of mystical practices, as these shapes were seen to reflect the order of the universe and the divine mind. The Greco-Egyptian period during the Hellenistic and Roman eras represents a critical point where Neoplatonism's influence on symbolism became particularly evident. Greek and Egyptian traditions, once thought to be separate, began to intertwine, especially with the rise of Hermeticism. For instance, the Ankh, an ancient Egyptian symbol of life, was no longer just a representation of physical existence, but was imbued with deeper mystical significance. The addition of geometric elements like ringlets or crossed lines in Greco-Egyptian magical texts suggested that these symbols were now actively used to connect the practitioner to divine realms. Neoplatonism's emphasis on spiritual ascent and the power of symbols helped to elevate these shapes and images to the status of powerful magical tools that could bridge the gap between earthly existence and divine realities. Neoplatonism's focus on mystical knowledge also coincided with the decline of literal interpretations of symbols and the rise of more abstract and mystical understandings. Philosophers like Plotinus and Porphyry argued that the material world was an illusion, and true knowledge could only be achieved through direct union with the divine. In this context, symbols ceased to be mere representations of the physical world and became a means of transcending it. As the mystical philosophy of Neoplatonism spread, symbols became increasingly divorced from their linguistic origins. Magical symbols from Egyptian, Greek, and later Roman practices were no longer understood just as written language or as part of ritual. Instead, they were seen as dynamic forces capable of transforming reality. The Neoplatonic philosophers encouraged the use of these abstract symbols in ritual, not just as representations of divine concepts, but as actual instruments to activate mystical experiences. The influence of Neoplatonism on magical symbolism did not end with the Greco-Egyptian period. It continued to shape the magical traditions of subsequent cultures, blending with Coptic, Byzantine, Islamic, Jewish, and Christian spiritual practices. Neoplatonic philosophy, with its emphasis on non-discursive symbolism and its belief in the transcendence of material reality, provided a robust framework for the development of magical symbols that transcended traditional linguistic boundaries. These symbols were not merely representations of physical reality, but were viewed as powerful tools that could directly influence the spiritual and material worlds. As the Greco-Roman world expanded, the Coptic and Byzantine traditions emerged, absorbing and adapting the symbols that had developed during the Greco-Egyptian period. Coptic magic, which flourished in Egypt and the surrounding regions during the early Christian period, continued to use many of the same symbols, such as the Ankh and the Eye of Horus, but imbued them with new meanings tied to Christianity and the evolving mysticism of the era. In Byzantine magical practices, the symbols of Greco-Egyptian magic were further refined and integrated into Christian iconography. These symbols were often associated with spiritual transformation, divine protection, and the ascent of the soul. Byzantine mystics, influenced by Neoplatonism, believed that these symbols could mediate access to the divine, acting as bridges between the material and the spiritual realms. Astrological symbols, planetary seals, and angelic glyphs became powerful components of Byzantine ritual magic, closely tied to the divine and the cosmic order. With the rise of Islamic mysticism, or Sufism, in the Middle Ages, many of the Greco-Egyptian and Byzantine symbols were integrated into Islamic magical and spiritual practices. Islamic thinkers, particularly those in the Abbasid Caliphate, were deeply influenced by the Greek philosophical tradition and the mystical aspects of Neoplatonism. They inherited and expanded on the idea that symbols could be used as tools for spiritual ascent and direct communication with the divine. In Islamic magic, symbols such as the Seal of Solomon and planetary symbols took on new significance. These symbols were empowered through the ritual invocation of angels and the divine names, and they were used for protection, healing, and divine intervention. Sufi mystics often used these symbols in their spiritual practices to transcend the material world and connect with the divine presence. Jewish mysticism, particularly in the Kabbalistic and Merkaba traditions, also incorporated the symbolism of the Greco-Egyptian and Byzantine magical systems. The Sefer Raziel, a key text in Jewish magic, is one example where these ancient symbols were adapted into Jewish ritual. The Merkaba mystics believed that the use of angelic seals, divine names, and astrological symbols could facilitate spiritual ascent, enabling the practitioner to experience direct encounters with the divine. In Kabbalah, these symbols took on even more profound meanings, as they were believed to hold the keys to divine knowledge and spiritual transformation. Symbols like the Tree of Life, the seals of angels, and the letters of the Hebrew alphabet became powerful tools in the process of soul elevation and mystical enlightenment. These symbols were not seen as simply representative. They were believed to hold intrinsic spiritual power, capable of reshaping the material world. As time passed, these magical symbols gradually shifted in their function. They were no longer tied to linguistic or phonetic meaning, but instead became part of cryptic alphabets used to encode hidden knowledge and divine secrets. This evolution marked a significant transformation in the role of symbols in magical practice. Cryptic alphabets, which had once been part of ritualistic magic, now began to function as autonomous systems of communication with the divine. These cryptic alphabets were used to replace traditional written languages in magical texts. The symbols were imbued with power and could be used as magical scripts to invoke supernatural forces. This development was part of a broader trend in Western esotericism and occult philosophy, where the written word was seen as a bridge to the divine, and symbols, rather than words, became the primary means of accessing hidden knowledge. In these later magical traditions, symbols like planetary sigils, angelic seals, and demonic glyphs were not merely decorative, they were active agents of transformation. The practitioner would inscribe or invoke these symbols in order to influence the spiritual and material realms. These symbols were believed to carry the magical force needed to bring about changes, whether for healing, protection, or spiritual enlightenment. Renaissance figures like Marsilio Ficino, Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, and Cornelius Agrippa were instrumental in preserving and expanding the use of these magical symbols. They revived the ancient symbols of Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, and Kabbalah, incorporating them into the occult philosophy of the Renaissance. These symbols were now seen as keys to accessing hidden realms, capable of transforming the soul and shaping reality through the power of ritual and secrecy. Magical symbols are far more than just images. They are deeply embedded in the cultural and spiritual fabric of countless societies. from their early origins in Greco-Egyptian magic to their persistence in Jewish, Islamic, and Christian magical traditions. These symbols have continuously shaped the way we understand magic, spirituality, and mysticism. These symbols are still powerful today, woven into modern practices such as Wicca, astrology, and other esoteric systems. Understanding the history of magical symbols allows us to connect with the ancient wisdom of our spiritual ancestors, giving us insight into the evolution of spiritual practices across cultures. Thank you for watching.